Hi, welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Back in episode 87, U.S. Pop Culture 1971 Part 1, I floated the idea of doing an episode about George Harrison's All Things Must Pass album and asked for some feedback on that. I got a lot of responses. I really appreciate everybody who responded. And based on the generally positive feedback, today we're going to have a bit of a departure. We're not going to do any Beach Boy topics. Instead, we're going to talk about George Harrison's All Things Must Pass album, which was released in the U.S. on November 27th, 1970. There's a clip from the Get Back sessions recorded on January 28, 1969, in which George is talking to John and Yoko about the fact that he has this big backlog of songs, enough to fill his quota on Beatle albums for like the next 10 years, and that he's thinking of doing an album quickly, like in a week, getting those songs out and kind of clearing the boards, sort of one, to get the songs out into the public so that they can be covered by other artists, and also just to see what a George Harrison solo album would sound like. He says it would take a week, it wouldn't break up the band, it would be very low impact on the Beatles. John and Yoko seemed to agree to the idea, and of course it never happened. A year and a half later, with the Beatles breakup official, I'll bet George was glad he didn't actually do that, because he found himself in the enviable position of having this huge backlog of excellent songs to draw on to launch his solo career. Now, of course, George had technically done 2 albums prior to this. In 1968, there'd been the soundtrack to the psychedelic freak-out film Wonderwall, and in 1969, he released a collection of whirs, crashes, buzzes, and hisses recorded on a Moog synthesizer and appropriately titled Electronic Sound. But this was the launch of his proper solo career. Of course, it's also worth mentioning that in 1970, early on, when it was first apparent that the Beatles had broken up, it wasn't entirely self-evident that George was going to have a solo career. He might have formed another band, he might have joined a band, he might have done production and session work, or he might have just retired from music altogether and studied Indian philosophy for the rest of his life. So it was kind of a surprise, I'm sure, to the general public when All Things Must Pass hit the stores in time for Christmas sales in 1970. One look at the album itself would have made it clear that this was a major release. It was a triple album housed in the kind of box that had generally been reserved for classical albums, though there certainly were examples from jazz, pop, and even a few rock albums that had been in boxes like this. The box itself shouted that this album was to be taken seriously. The album cover was somber, stately, with George very much on his own, surrounded by 4 stone garden gnomes that may have been some reference to the Beatles, and certainly I think at the time people took the title All Things Must Pass as a reference to the Beatles breakup. Over the years, some of the outtakes from this photo session have become available, and I'll be showing some of those during this episode. Each of the albums was enclosed in a tasteful colored sleeve with the lyrics and very few graphics. Kind of surprisingly for such an austere album, it included a giant full-color poster of George taken at his Friar Park home. The album kicks off with a Bob Dylan, George Harrison co-write, I'd Have You Any Time. It's an unexpectedly low-key way to open the album. It doesn't start with one of the big hit singles, My Sweet Lord or What Is Life. It doesn't start with a big rocker like Wawa. I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One is the fact that it is a Bob Dylan co-write. George wrote the Let Me In Here bits, and Bob contributed the All I Have Is Yours parts. George said he wrote his lyrics in part as a subtle plea to Dylan to let George get closer to him. Of course, on the surface, they're about romantic love. A lot of people have observed that George's best lyrics often have this double application. Often the lyrics can be interpreted as being about romantic love or about spiritual devotion, depending on your point of view and interpretation. I think by placing this song as the opening track on the album, it gives it a potential third meaning. If we go back to early Beatles singles, Love Me Do, Please Please Me, From Me to You, the Beatles have said that while they were lyrics about romantic love, there was also an undercurrent of asking the public to love the band. And I think by placing the lines, let me in here, I know I've been here, let me into your heart, as the opening lines on the album, it's maybe a bit of a plea for George to be accepted as a solo artist. There was probably also some desire to point out the fact that he's collaborating with Bob Dylan, and while he's not working with Lennon, McCartney, and Starkey anymore, George is still working with the best of the best. It's a strange track to open the album, particularly a big Phil Spector produced epic like this, but I think it really works. In architectural terms, Frank Lloyd Wright often designed small little entryways into his buildings to serve as a transition from the outside so that the impact of the main room would be even bigger. Maybe a better analogy for this album is a cathedral. You rarely have a cathedral where you walk from the outside into the main hall of the cathedral. Usually there's a little vestibule there that you go through, which makes the impact of the hall all that much greater when you enter. I'd Have You Anytime serves a function kind of like that when we reach the second track, My Sweet Lord. Of course, musically, My Sweet Lord is very similar to the Chiffons' 1963 hit, He's So Fine. And of course, George always maintained that he had the Edwin Hawkins singer's Oh Happy Day in mind when he started writing the song. I don't doubt that at all. I know the Beatles, like a lot of other people, would often vaguely have some other song in mind as inspiration when they started writing. And I think at this point in his career, George was definitely savvy enough that if he had thought of He's So Fine, he would have changed it enough to avoid a lawsuit. Of course, melodies like this often go in a certain pattern, and I don't think it's at all surprising that George would come up with something very similar without realizing he was doing it. Of course, in 1976, we know George was found guilty of unconscious plagiarism for My Sweet Lord. Though he didn't intend it, I think this was probably the right call. The songs are just too similar to let it slide completely. My Sweet Lord had originally been recorded in January of 1970 by Billy Preston for his George Harrison produced Encouraging Words album. The song was released as a single in the UK only on September 4th, 1970. The album was released on September 11th, 1970 in the UK and on November 9th, 1970 in the US, meaning that Billy Preston's version was out nearly 3 months before George's version. Preston's arrangement is simpler and it's a much more spiritual version with prominent piano, bass, drums, guitars, and not surprisingly a great organ solo. There's a churchy background choir with plenty of hallelujahs and only 2 Hare Krishnas. It has a much funkier feel to it. I wonder if anyone listening to this more spiritual, less poppy version of My Sweet Lord would have ever noted the similarity to He's So Fine. Personally, I doubt it. I love Billy Preston's version. I really love George's version. The strumming guitars at the beginning are uplifting, and when that lead guitar comes in, the record really soars. It's got a real joyful confidence about it. I've heard it hundreds and hundreds of times, and it always makes me happy. You don't need any religion to feel like the clouds are parting and the sun is coming through when you listen to My Sweet Lord. And I really think Phil Spector's production works well on this track. My Sweet Lord was, of course, the lead-off single from the album and went to #1 on both sides of the Atlantic, making it the first #1 hit by any of the former Beatles. Next up is Wawa, and we know exactly when George wrote that. On January 10th, 1969, during what would become known as the Get Back sessions, George quit the Beatles. There'd been tensions with Paul during the day, but apparently it was a lunchtime argument with John that made George walk. As he noted in his journal, he quit the Beatles and wrote Wawa on that day. In this event, George seemingly found strength in adversity. It's probably the best rocker George ever wrote. It's assured, strong, and nearly as relatable an anthem of liberation from a bad situation as Paths of Victory. After a meeting with the other Beatles to work things out, George returned to the Beatles when the sessions moved to Apple Studios on January 22nd, 1969. After some warm-ups, Wawa was the first track that was recorded for the album. George said it was sounding great in the studio, and when he came in and heard what Spector had done with it, it was completely different. Apparently, it was Eric Clapton saying he liked Spector's production that kept George from showing Spector the door and finding a new producer. A lot of people have complained about Spector's production. I have a friend who says that in certain parts, the album has so much on it that it sounds warped. It sounds like the whole was a little off kilter or something because there's just too much on the tracks. Personally, I like it in most places with some reservations. George's work later on can sound a little thin, and this is certainly the antithesis of that. That said, I would give anything to hear this track and the rest of the album as George originally envisioned it. The fourth track on the album and the final track on side 1 is the first version of Isn't It a Pity, an anthem-length track that to my ears is a perfect subject for Phil Spector's production. At 7 minutes 10 seconds, it's nearly identical in length to Hey Jude. Side 2 begins with the track What Is Life? From the title, you'd expect that this was going to be some ethereal, spiritual, inward-looking thing along the lines of The Inner Light. With its big chewy horn section and pop hooks, it's definitely not that. In the US, it was released as the second single from the album, where it reached number 10 on the chart. With the second track, side 2 begins taking on something of a country feel, which we haven't really seen from George before and won't really see again. Presumably, this is some of the influence of Bob Dylan and the band, not only their recent records, but also from the fact that George had enjoyed spending time with them periodically over the last year and a half or so. If Not For You, of course, was a track on Bob Dylan's New Morning album, which was released on October 21st, 1970, about a month before All Things Must Pass. George had played slide guitar on Dylan's version cut on May 1st, 1970, so he knew the song well before it was released. And it was among the tracks that he demoed for Phil Spector at the end of May. The version Dylan released on New Morning was a remake done in August. The version with George would eventually be released in 1991 on the Bootleg series, volumes 1 through 3. It's a beautiful song and George does a nice job with it. It eventually became one of Dylan's most covered songs, so getting his version out less than a month after Dylan's own put him a little bit ahead of the curve on this. That's followed by Behind That Locked Door, a rare country tune from George, and then Let It Down. The verses of Let It Down are absolutely beautiful. The transition from the gentle, ethereal verses to the apocalyptic everything in the kitchen sink choruses can be jarring. It's a bit like the Who Ran the Iron Horse section of Cabanescence, and I've got to believe it was the Spector influences that made the choruses so bombastic. George had previewed the song during the Get Back sessions in early 1969, with the choruses being more a continuation of the verses. I think I would have preferred this approach. It doesn't ruin the track for me, but the verses are so blissful that I'd prefer not to be jarred out of them with the big chorus. Closing out side 2 is Run of the Mill, a beautiful song with a big chewy horn section. Side 3 begins with Beware of Darkness. This is one of the album's outstanding tracks. It has a beautiful melody, though the lyrics are the kind of things that people would complain about on some of George's subsequent albums, that his work could become preachy, parsimonious, or even hectoring. Here, the sermon is delivered with a warmth that makes it a cut above the rest. Leon Russell did a nice cover version of Beware of Darkness on Leon Russell and the Shelter People, released in May of 1971. His version has some Indian influences in the percussion and some touches that are a little reminiscent of Tomorrow Never Knows. It set up a nice duet for George and Leon Russell at the Concert for Bangladesh in August of 1971. Next up is Apple Scruffs. It's an acoustic guitar and harmonica track in the folky Bob Dylan style. You'd think this would sound a little thin coming after these big tracks on the album, but say what you will about Spector's production, he makes it sound full and fit in with the rest of the album. It's one of my very favorite tracks. Of course, it's about the young female fans who hung out outside of the Apple offices, but like much of George's best lyric, it can have more than one application. That's followed by The Ballad of Sir Frankie Crisp, Let It Roll, another one that reminds me of Stained Glass. And it's one of the few places on any rock album where somebody can use the pronoun ye without being made fun of. Following that, for a change of pace, we get a nice rocker, A Waiting on You All, and closing out the side is All Things Must Pass, the title track. Like several other songs from the album, Isn't It a Pity, Let It Down, and Hear Me Lord, George had initially worked on All Things Must Pass with the Beatles during the Get Back sessions. A Beatle version of All Things Must Pass was finally released on the big Let It Be box set in 2021. Of course, the first initial release of All Things Must Pass came from Billy Preston on the Encouraging Words album, again produced by George Harrison. Billy Preston's version is very different. It has a much jazzier sound and the kind of string section that we'd associate with Gamble and Huff's Philadelphia productions a few years later. During the final fade, the strings take on an almost Christmassy feel. George's version of All Things Must Pass is a great track. It's a highlight of the album and one of George's signature tunes. Since George produced the Encouraging Words album, it's interesting to listen to All Things Must Pass and My Sweet Lord here and wonder if possibly this is more the type of production that George had in mind before Phil Spector put his stamp on All Things Must Pass. If so, I'd have to say that I think the production would have been much more typical of what you heard in 1970 and less distinct had somebody other than Spector handled the production. Just an idea and just based on listening to Encouraging Words. I am a little more adamant about the fact that as we begin side 4, this is where the album runs out of gas. It begins with I Dig Love, which is fine on its own. It's a fun, quirky little change of pace, but running just under 5 minutes, it wears out its welcome long before it ends. A 2 minute, 30-second version of this would have been plenty. And coming at the beginning of side 4, the length gives the impression of padding out the album to make it double length. Next up is Art of Dying, which is a fine track. I get the feeling that George particularly loved this track, maybe a little more than anybody else, but it's a fine track. It does suffer a little bit from that preachiness that would dog him later on in his career. These lyrics do not have multiple applications. That's followed by yet another version of Isn't It a Pity, which is a great song, but I'm not really sure that we need 2 versions of it. And again, it gives the impression that they're running out of gas on side 4. The album closes with Hear Me Lord, which is an anthem, and it's nice to have an anthem to close out a side, to close out a big double album, in fact, but this is not George's strongest anthem. Again, it's a song that would have been fine at a shorter length, but it seems like it's being stretched to fill out the album. I'd always thought if George had put 1 or 2 more decent songs on side 4 and lifted it to the level of the first 3 sides, he'd have taken a great album and made it one of the greatest albums. And he had the material too. Among the tracks he had previewed for Spectre in May was Beautiful Girl, I Don't Want to Do It, several others. And he had a nearly complete version of I Live For You already in the can that could have been finished up. Anything to sort of vary side 4, make it a little more interesting, would have really lifted the whole album. And of course, we're not quite done yet because there's still the 3rd disc, the Apple Jam. The record features intriguing titles like I Remember Jeep and Thanks for the Pepperoni, but apart from the short It's Johnny's Birthday, recorded for John Lennon's 30th, it's a series of long in-studio jams that wouldn't have cut it as a George Harrison bootleg. I suspect it was included to make the package more of a deluxe event, and possibly to shed light on George as a guitarist jamming with other great players, including, of course, Eric Clapton. This was a period with lots of discussion about who the great rock guitar players were, with Clapton, Hendrix, and Jimmy Page usually being the most frequently mentioned. The inclusion of these jams might have been intended to show that George wasn't just a guy who did solo breaks on Beatle records, but could jam in the modern early 70s sense. Let me know if I'm wrong, of course, but I doubt very many people have ever played the Apple Jam disc more than once for entertainment value. I really wish they had kept this a tightly focused double album and used the money for the Apple Jam disc to put like a big booklet inside the package or something. Though I can see in 1970, George Harrison might have thought a booklet with a bunch of fab pics was a little too Beatlemania and really preferred the artistically relevant All-Star Jam disc instead. The album has been re-released over the years with bonus materials, most notably the 30th anniversary edition, and in 2021, a big 5-disc 50th anniversary edition. I'd love to talk about those. We simply don't have time here. George would make some good records throughout the rest of his solo career. Of course, he never had the wealth of great material that he had to create All Things Must Pass ever again. Very few people ever have a backlog of material like that. While I do have a few quibbles, I wish side 4 was a little stronger, and I wish they had made it a tightly focused double album rather than including that jam disc. It remains a great album, George Harrison's best album, one of my all-time favorite albums, and a real landmark in popular music. Hope you enjoyed this. I know it's a bit of a departure. We'll be back to the Beach Boys next week. Please let me know what you think about this and any comments on the All Things Must Pass album. Please like and subscribe if you haven't done that. I would really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time. Thank you. Bye.